October 14, 1944. 12:17 p.m. A country road near Herrlingen, Germany. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel sat in the back seat of the black Mercedes staff car, watching the autumn countryside roll past through windows that felt increasingly like the walls of a moving coffin. Two generals sat beside him, Wilhelm Burgdorf and Ernst Mazel, men he barely knew, men whose faces carried the expressionless mask of executioners. They had arrived at his home an hour earlier with a message from Berlin, from the Führer himself, and Rommel had understood immediately what their presence meant. The small glass vial in Burgdorf's coat pocket contained cyanide. Within 15 minutes, Rommel would be dead, murdered by the regime he had served with such devotion, killed by the man he had once believed was Germany's salvation. In those final moments, as the car moved through the quiet German countryside where children still played and farmers still worked their fields, Rommel's mind traveled back across the years, across the deserts and the victories and the slow, terrible awakening to a truth that would cost him everything. The realization had not come all at once. That was the horror of it, the thing that would haunt his final thoughts. It had come in pieces, in moments of doubt that he had pushed away, in orders that made no military sense, in atrocities he had heard whispered about but chosen not to investigate too closely. The truth about Adolf Hitler had been there all along, written in blood and madness, but Rommel had been too dazzled by his own success, too intoxicated by the myth of the Desert Fox, too invested in the belief that Germany's cause was just and Hitler was its visionary leader. By the time he finally understood what he was serving, by the time the scales fell from his eyes and he saw the monster behind the rhetoric, it was far too late to matter. The machine he had helped build was unstoppable, and it would consume him along with millions of others. To understand what Rommel realized about Hitler too late, you must go back to the beginning, back to when Erwin Rommel was a young officer in the First World War, back before the Nazi Party existed, before Hitler was anything more than a failed art student and bitter veteran among millions. Rommel had been a superb tactical officer even then, winning the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military honor, for his actions in the Italian Alps. He had led mountain troops through impossible terrain, had captured thousands of Italian soldiers through speed and deception rather than brute force. He had discovered something fundamental about himself in that war. He was brilliant at the operational level, at seeing opportunities others missed, at moving faster than the enemy thought possible. But he was not a political creature. He did not think deeply about causes or ideologies. He was a soldier, and soldiers followed orders, and the righteousness of those orders was someone else's responsibility. After Germany's defeat in 1918, after the humiliation of Versailles and the chaos of the Weimar Republic, Rommel had remained in the shrunken Reichswehr, teaching tactics and writing about his wartime experiences. He had watched his country spiral into economic collapse and political violence, had seen the communists and the Nazis battle in the streets, had witnessed the paralysis of democratic institutions that seemed incapable of providing order or purpose. When Hitler came to power in 1933, Rommel had not been particularly political about it. The Nazis promised to restore German military power, to undo the humiliations of Versailles, to make Germany strong again. For a professional soldier who had spent 15 years in an army limited to 100,000 men, forbidden to have tanks or aircraft, these promises were intoxicating. Hitler had recognized Rommel's talents early. In 1938, the Führer had appointed Rommel to command the War Academy, then later to command his personal security battalion. Rommel had been flattered by the attention, had been thrilled to be close to power, to be recognized by the man who was transforming Germany. He had seen Hitler as a leader of almost supernatural political genius, someone who had achieved bloodless victories through sheer force of will, the remilitarization of the Rhineland, the annexation of Austria, the acquisition of Czechoslovakia. The Wehrmacht was growing, Germany was rearming, and Rommel was being given opportunities that would have been impossible in the old army. When war came in 1939, he had been ready, eager even, to prove himself in this new kind of mechanized warfare. His command of the 7th Panzer Division during the invasion of France in 1940 had made him famous. While other commanders advanced cautiously, worried about their flanks and supply lines, Rommel had driven his division forward with relentless aggression, moving so fast that he lost radio contact with higher headquarters, earning his division the nickname, Ghost Division, because no one knew where it was. He had reached the English Channel in days, had captured tens of thousands of French and British soldiers, had demonstrated that speed and audacity could shatter conventional defenses. Hitler had been delighted, had promoted him, had sent him to North Africa to shore up the failing Italian forces. The Desert War had been Rommel's masterpiece, the campaign that would make him a legend. In Libya and Egypt, far from the ideological struggles and racial policies of the Eastern Front, Rommel had fought what seemed like a clean war, a war of maneuver and tactics against British forces that he respected. He had won brilliant victories at Tobruk and Gazala, had driven almost to Alexandria, had made his name synonymous with military genius. The British and Americans had respected him, had called him the Desert Fox, had recognized in him a professional soldier rather than a Nazi fanatic. Even Winston Churchill had praised him in Parliament, saying that Rommel was a great general despite being on the wrong side. But even in North Africa, there had been moments when the mask had slipped, when Rommel should have seen what he was serving. There had been orders from Berlin about the treatment of captured commandos, orders that contradicted the rules of war. There had been Einsatzgruppen units following behind the army in other theaters, death squads that had nothing to do with military operations. There had been whispers about what was happening to Jews in occupied territories, rumors that Rommel had dismissed as exaggerations or propaganda. He had been too focused on his own campaigns, too absorbed in the tactical challenges of desert warfare, too convinced that his duty was to win battles and let others handle the political aspects of the war. The defeats in North Africa had been the beginning of his education. When Montgomery had broken his lines at El Alamein in November 1942, when American forces had landed in Morocco and Algeria, Rommel had recognized that the strategic situation was hopeless. He had wanted to conduct an orderly retreat, to preserve his army to fight another day. Hitler had forbidden it. The Führer had ordered him to hold every meter of ground, to die in place rather than withdraw. Rommel had tried to explain that this was military suicide, that the Afrika Korps would be destroyed for nothing. Hitler had been unmoved. The orders were not about military logic but about Hitler's psychological need to never admit defeat, to never give up territory regardless of the cost. Rommel had eventually retreated anyway, disobeying direct orders from the Führer, saving what remained of his army but ensuring that he would never again have Hitler's complete trust. The Afrika Korps had been forced back across Libya, then into Tunisia, where it had been trapped and finally destroyed in May 1943. Rommel had been evacuated before the end, sent back to Germany, awarded medals and given public praise, while being privately blamed for the defeat. He had begun to understand that Hitler's strategy was not strategy at all but a kind of magical thinking that refused to acknowledge reality. His appointment to command Army Group B in France in late 1943 had given him a new perspective, a view of the war from the perspective of someone who could see the larger picture. Rommel had inspected the Atlantic Wall, the fortifications that were supposed to prevent an Allied invasion, and had been horrified by what he found. The defenses were incomplete, poorly designed, built more for propaganda purposes than military effectiveness. He had thrown himself into improving them, had worked frantically to build obstacles and minefields and gun positions, but he had also begun to understand that Germany was going to lose the war. The industrial capacity of America and Britain, combined with Soviet manpower, was simply overwhelming. Germany was being crushed between three massive opponents, and Hitler's response was to speak of secret weapons and willpower while refusing to consider any political solution. The invasion had come on June 6, 1944, at Normandy, and Rommel had been away from his headquarters, visiting his wife for her birthday. The Allies had achieved complete surprise, had landed overwhelming forces, and Hitler had refused to release the panzer reserves that might have driven them back into the sea. The Führer had been asleep when the invasion began, and his staff had been too terrified to wake him. By the time the armored divisions were committed, it was too late. Rommel had fought desperately to contain the beachhead, had thrown everything he had against the Allied positions, but the material superiority was too great. Every time he concentrated his forces for a counterattack, Allied air power would smash them before they could advance. It was during the Normandy campaign that Rommel had finally, completely understood what Hitler was. Not a genius. Not a visionary. Not even a rational leader pursuing an evil ideology with terrible efficiency. Hitler was mad, delusional, living in a fantasy world where willpower could overcome industrial capacity, where enemies were simultaneously subhuman and all-powerful, where military advice was treason and loyalty meant accepting whatever insane orders came from Berlin. Rommel had watched as the Führer refused to allow any withdrawal from France even as the front collapsed, had seen entire armies encircled and destroyed because Hitler could not psychologically accept retreat. The July 20th assassination attempt against Hitler had failed, and in the paranoid purge that followed, anyone who had ever expressed doubts about the Führer's leadership was suspect. Rommel had not been part of the conspiracy, but he had known about it, had spoken with some of the conspirators, had expressed his belief that Germany needed to make peace before it was completely destroyed. That had been enough. In the new Germany that Hitler was creating in his bunker, doubt was treason, and treason meant death. But Rommel was too famous to simply arrest and shoot. The Desert Fox was a national hero, and his execution would damage morale. So Hitler had given him a choice: take poison and die quietly, and your family will be protected and your reputation preserved. Refuse, and face trial, execution, and the punishment of your wife and son. As the Mercedes continued down that country road, Rommel thought about all the moments when he could have seen the truth, when the evidence had been right in front of him but he had chosen to look away. He thought about the Jewish families he had seen being rounded up in France, about the orders to shoot prisoners that he had sometimes ignored but never openly challenged. He thought about the fanatical SS units that fought under his command but answered to a different chain of command, units that committed atrocities and called it loyalty. He thought about the slave laborers who had built the Atlantic Wall fortifications, worked to death and then replaced by new victims. He thought about the fact that he had known, on some level, what kind of regime he was serving, but had told himself that his duty was to Germany rather than to the Nazi Party, that he was a soldier not a politician, that military honor could exist separately from political evil. The realization that had come too late was that there was no separation, that by lending his military genius to Hitler's cause he had become complicit in everything the regime did, that there was no such thing as fighting a clean war in the service of a genocidal ideology. Every victory he had won, every tactical brilliance he had displayed, had prolonged the war and enabled the Holocaust. The Desert Fox had been a propaganda tool, used to convince Germans and even neutral countries that the Wehrmacht was professional and honorable, that this was a conventional war between nations rather than a crusade of extermination. Rommel had been the acceptable face of Nazism, the general who could be admired without moral compromise, and he had played that role willingly because it had fed his vanity and his ambition. The car stopped in a quiet clearing away from the main road. Bergdorf opened his briefcase and removed a document, which he read to Rommel in a flat, bureaucratic voice. The charges were vague: conspiracy against the Führer, defeatism, contact with traitors. The verdict was already decided. Rommel could take the poison and die within 15 minutes, painlessly. His death would be announced as a heart attack or war wounds. He would receive a state funeral with full military honors. His wife would receive his pension. His son would not be punished. Or he could refuse, and face the People's Court, and watch everything he loved be destroyed along with him. Rommel asked for a few minutes to think, though there was really nothing to think about. He sat in the car and looked out at the German countryside. The land he had fought for, the nation he had served. He thought about his son Manfred, barely 15 years old, growing up in a Germany that was being destroyed by the madness Rommel had helped enable. He thought about all the soldiers who had died following his orders, believing they were fighting for something noble rather than serving a regime that would be remembered as history's greatest evil. He thought about the fact that his death would be announced as natural causes, that the truth would be buried, that even in death he would be used as propaganda for the system he had finally rejected. The cyanide worked quickly. Rommel crushed the glass vial between his teeth, felt the bitter taste, and then his body convulsed as the poison stopped his heart. The two generals sat silently beside his corpse as the driver turned the car around and headed back toward Rommel's home, where they would tell his wife that the field marshal had suffered a fatal seizure on the drive. The body would be examined by doctors who knew better than to ask questions. The funeral would be held with Hitler sending a wreath and a message of condolence. The nation would mourn the loss of its greatest general, never knowing that he had been murdered by the regime he served. The tragedy of Erwin Rommel was not that he was an evil man. He was not a sadist like some SS commanders, not a fanatic like Goebbels, not a bureaucrat of death like Eichmann. His tragedy was that he was a talented, ambitious man who had subordinated his moral judgment to his professional skill, who had told himself that military excellence was a virtue separate from the causes it served. He had been seduced by success, by fame, by the intoxication of being recognized as a genius. By the time he understood what he was part of, the machine had grown too powerful to stop, and his realization had come too late to matter. What Rommel realized about Hitler too late was not just that the Führer was mad or evil, though he was both. What Rommel realized was that there is no such thing as honorable service to a dishonorable cause, that professional competence in the service of genocide is not a virtue but a crime, that the soldier's duty to follow orders ends when those orders serve evil. He realized that his tactical brilliance and military honor had been tools used by the regime to legitimize itself, that every victory he won had bought time for the death camps to operate, that his fame had been used to convince ordinary Germans that they were on the right side. He realized that his silence about atrocities he had witnessed or heard about was not political neutrality but moral cowardice, that by telling himself his duty was purely military he had abdicated his duty as a human being. This realization had come too late because Rommel had spent years ignoring the evidence, dismissing the warnings, choosing to believe that Hitler was a flawed but ultimately effective leader rather than accepting that he was serving a regime committed to crimes against humanity. The Desert Fox had been brilliant at reading terrain and anticipating enemy movements, but he had been deliberately blind to the moral terrain he was operating in, the landscape of choices that every person must navigate when confronted with evil. He had chosen career over conscience, success over morality, and by the time he tried to reverse course it was far too late. The war was lost, Germany was being destroyed, millions were already dead, and his attempted redemption through contact with the conspirators had been too little and too ambiguous to change anything. In the weeks after Rommel's death, the truth was carefully managed. The state funeral was held in Ulm on October 18, with Field Marshal von Rundstedt giving the eulogy and claiming that Rommel's heart had given out from his wounds and the strain of command. The crowd that lined the streets believed they were mourning a hero. Hitler's wreath bore the message, "To one of our best army commanders." The German people never learned that their greatest general had been murdered on the Führer's orders, that the Desert Fox had died not from war wounds but from an assassin's poison, that his last months had been spent in despair over the regime he had served and the catastrophe he had helped enable. The full truth would only emerge after the war, when Rommel's wife and son revealed what had really happened, when documents were discovered showing the threat Hitler had used to force Rommel's suicide. By then, the myth of the good German general was already well established, the idea that Rommel had been a clean Wehrmacht officer untainted by Nazi ideology. This was partly true. Rommel had not been an ideological Nazi, had not personally participated in war crimes, had sometimes disobeyed orders to kill prisoners. But it was also a comfortable lie, a way for post-war Germany and even for the Allies to separate military professionalism from political complicity, to pretend that there was a clear line between serving in Hitler's armies and serving Hitler's purposes. The officers who had served under Rommel remembered him with conflicting emotions. Many loved him for his tactical skill and personal courage, for the way he shared the dangers of the front line and never asked his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Others recognized that his brilliance had prolonged an evil war, that every month the conflict continued meant more people dying in combat and more victims murdered in concentration camps. They understood what Rommel himself had realized too late, that in the context of the Nazi regime, military virtue became a tool of evil, that tactical excellence in the service of genocide was not something to be proud of but something to be ashamed of. The historians who studied Rommel's life and career would debate for decades about his moral culpability, about whether he was a victim of the regime or complicit in its crimes, about when he knew what and what he could have done about it. The truth, as with most historical figures, was complex and uncomfortable. Rommel was neither a monster nor a hero but a man who made terrible choices while telling himself they were necessary, who saw evidence of evil and chose to focus on military matters instead, who realized the truth only when it was far too late to act on that knowledge in any meaningful way. The legacy of Rommel's realization echoes across the decades as a warning about the seductions of professional excellence divorced from moral judgment, about the dangers of separating technical competence from ethical responsibility. It serves as a reminder that following orders is not an excuse when those orders serve evil, that political neutrality in the face of atrocity is not neutrality at all but complicity, that professional soldiers serve political causes whether they acknowledge it or not and therefore have a responsibility to consider what causes they serve. Young officers at military academies still study Rommel's campaigns, still learn from his tactical innovations and operational brilliance. But the deeper lesson of his life is not about how to maneuver armored divisions or exploit enemy weaknesses. The deeper lesson is about the moment when he should have said no, when he should have refused to serve, when his duty to humanity should have overridden his duty to his country's government. That moment came years before his death, probably came multiple times, and each time he chose career and success and national loyalty over the harder choice of resistance. The country road near Hurlingen where Rommel died is quiet now, marked by a small memorial that draws occasional visitors who know the story. The desert where he won his greatest victories is still there, unchanging, indifferent to the battles that were fought across it. The beaches of Normandy where his defensive efforts failed are now peaceful, dotted with memorials to those who died liberating Europe from the regime Rommel served. History has moved on, as history always does, but the questions Rommel's life raises remain urgent. What do we do when our professional skills serve evil purposes? When do we have the moral obligation to refuse orders, to resign, to resist even at the cost of our careers and possibly our lives? How do we recognize when a cause we initially believed in has become something monstrous? And what do we do when we finally realize the truth but realize it too late, when the machine we helped build has grown too powerful to stop? Rommel never answered these questions satisfactorily, either for himself or for history. He was a brilliant tactical commander who served a genocidal regime, a man of personal courage who lacked moral courage until it was too late, a soldier who believed military honor could exist separately from political evil and learned through bitter experience that it could not. His realization came in pieces, in moments of doubt he suppressed, in evidence he chose to ignore, in moral compromises that became easier with each repetition until he no longer recognized himself. By the time he fully understood what Hitler was, what the Nazi regime represented, what cause he had devoted his talents to serving, the war was lost and his own death was inevitable. The knowledge gave him no chance at redemption, no opportunity to undo the damage his service had enabled, no way to warn others who might still avoid the mistakes he had made. It was simply the burden he carried in his final months, the weight of understanding that he had wasted his brilliance in service of evil, that his fame was built on complicity with crimes against humanity, that the military honors he had earned were stained with the blood of innocents. The glass vial of cyanide that killed Erwin Rommel was the final gift of the regime he had served, the last order he followed, the ultimate expression of Hitler's power over those who had enabled his rise. The desert fox, who had been so brilliant at reading terrain and anticipating enemy movements, had been fatally blind to the moral landscape he inhabited, unable to see the monster behind the metals until the monster turned on him as it eventually turned on everyone. No state funeral could hide the truth. No propaganda could change what he had realized too late. And only the quiet German countryside, witness to his final moments, remembered the real story of how Erwin Rommel died, not as a hero struck down by wounds or illness, but as a man who had finally seen the truth about Adolf Hitler and paid for that knowledge with his life, murdered by the regime he had served so brilliantly and understood so poorly until understanding came too late to matter.